Oh, great, great. Yeah, sorry about that. To go back to the beginning, Louise Brown, the world's first IVF baby, was born in England in 1978. And this really made world news because the work towards this had been decades in the making. And during those years, most people thought that it would never be possible to make what they called a test tube baby. But a couple of years later, Australia's first IVF baby, Candice Reese, was born. The success rates in those early days of IVF were incredibly low because doctors relied on getting the one and only egg that a woman produces every month at the right time. To find that time, hormone levels were measured many times every day until the surge of the luteinizing hormone was detected. And because ovulation happens about 36 hours after the LH surge, once that was detected, the laparoscopic egg collection procedure was scheduled, and that could really be at any time, even in the middle of the night. There were really a lot of hit and miss in the early stages of IVF because sometimes they got in too early and the egg was immature, and sometimes they got in too late and ovulation had already happened. And sometimes the egg was lost in the actual procedure. And on the occasion when an egg was retrieved, the culture systems were very rudimentary, so very few eggs actually developed into embryos. So the chance of a baby from IVF in the first few years after the first birth was probably around 1%, which meant that a lot of women went through a lot of treatment without getting a baby. Next slide. See if I can get the next slide as well. Okay, so over the years that followed, there were some significant developments that made IVF much more efficient. One of the biggest was the development of ovarian stimulation, which saw women getting 8 to 10 eggs rather than the one produced in a natural cycle. And because egg maturation was triggered with a hormone injection given at a certain time, the timing of egg collection could be scheduled and improve the chance, and this improved the chance of getting the eggs when they were at their optimal stage of maturity. Another big one was the move from laparoscopy to retrieve eggs to very simple and quick ultrasound-guided procedure. And the ability to freeze embryos made IVF both safer and more efficient, because before that, if more than one embryo was available, they were all transferred to the uterus. And this really led to very high risks of multiple births, and not just twins, but triplets and quads and more. And this, of course, came with high risks of obstetric and neonatal complications. In the 1990s, ICSI was the breakthrough that gave couples with male factor infertility a chance to have biologically related children. Before that, the only way they could have a child was by using donor sperm. But with ICSI, even very severe male factor infertility could be treated because the embryologist used specialized equipment to pick up a single sperm and physically inject it into the egg. And of course, over the years, there's also been significant improvement in the embryo culture media and systems, and this has resulted in much higher chance of normal embryos developing. Next slide. This is just a really quick recap of IVF and ICSI and how it goes. And I think you're all familiar with this, but for both ICSI and IVF, the woman takes a couple of weeks of drugs to stimulate the ovaries. When the eggs are deemed to be mature, they are retrieved. And in IVF, some 50,000 or whatever number of sperm are added to each egg, hoping that the eggs will fertilize and develop to embryos. And in ICSI, special equipment is used, as I just mentioned, to inject one sperm into each egg. And then after some 5 days, usually, embryos that have developed are assessed, and if there's one that looks suitable for transfer, is put back into the uterus, and if there are more embryos, they're frozen for later use. And 2 weeks later, a pregnancy test will reveal if the treatment has worked. Next slide. Most IVF treatment in Australia today is provided by shareholder-owned large corporations, some of which are multinational and operate in many countries. IVF treatment is quite generously subsidized by Medicare and PBS, which pays for most of the drugs that are used. To be eligible for these government supports, people have to be medically infertile, but apart from that, there are few restrictions and there is no limit on the number of cycles that can be subsidized. About 80,000 cycles were performed in Australia in 2019. And we in Australia have actually one of the highest number of IVF cycles per million women in the world. The cost of a stimulated cycle is around $10,000, and about half of that is out of pocket for patients. But there are some low-cost clinics where the cost to the patient is lower. Next slide. Check that we're on the same slide. In a 2019 article in The Conversation, Catherine Walby noted that the fertility industry then was worth $550 million per year, which was expected to increase to $630 million this year. And she did point out that the biggest clinics are publicly listed. Next slide. I mentioned earlier some of the historical developments that really made a big difference to the chance of having a baby with IVF. But in more recent times, there's been an explosion in the development of a range of different so-called add-ons. And add-ons, they are the optional extras that are offered on top of standard IVF treatment. They usually come with an additional cost, and they can include some tests, procedures, drugs, use of new equipment, and also, of course, alternative therapies. But the trouble is that for most of these add-ons, there's not really good evidence that they improve the chance of having a live baby. And also, we don't know too much about whether they have risks or not. Next slide. Here are some of the most common add-ons. PGT-A is a genetic test to screen embryos for extra or missing chromosomes with the aim of selecting chromosomally normal embryos for transfer. Time-lapse technology in the IVF lab allows you to leave the embryos in the incubator while a camera continuously takes images of how they develop. These images are then put together into film, and the embryologist can use this film to evaluate the embryos without taking them in and out of the incubator. In assisted hatching, a small hole is made in the zona pellucida that surrounds the egg to make it easier for the embryo to hatch and implant. And in endometrial scratching, the lining in the uterus is scratched using a small sterile plastic tube the month before treatment. And the theory behind this is that it will trigger the body to repair the site of the scratch, and that this in turn would release chemicals and hormones that make the lining more receptive to an embryo implanting. Embryo glue is a hyaluron-enriched embryo transfer medium, and this is to help implantation of embryos. And sperm selection methods include a range of methods to help embryologists choose the best sperm for IVF. And of course, apart from all the clinical add-ons, and the list that I've just shown is just a small sample, there are of course any number of complementary therapies, including acupuncture and Chinese herbs, and they all claim to improve the chance of having a baby. Next slide. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Sarah Lensen, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at Melbourne University. Her PhD included quite a heroic, I think, multi-center randomized controlled trial on the effectiveness of endometrial scratching. And this trial included almost 1,400 women from fertility clinics in several countries. The findings were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and they showed that there was no difference in live birth rates between those who had the scratch and those who didn't. Sarah now has an NHMRC investigator grant, where she's hoping to explore the reasons why add-ons are offered in reproductive medicine, and she also wants to develop resources to help people make informed decisions about using them. Next slide. Sarah and I have worked together on 2 studies in the last couple of years. In the first study, we reviewed the content on IVF clinic websites in Australia and New Zealand, and we recorded all the details about which add-ons clinic offered, what they said these add-ons could do, what they cost, whether potential risks were mentioned, and whether there was any reference to the evidence behind them. So what we found was that almost 80% of clinics had listed 1 or more add-ons on their website. In total, 21 different add-ons were listed. The cost ranged from nothing to, $3,700. The nothing is, some clinics included some of the add-ons in their routine care, and there was no extra charge for it. The most commonly mentioned add-on was PGT-A, followed by time-lapse and assisted hatching. And in 77% of add-ons that were mentioned, there were accompanied claims of benefit. Next slide. As part of this work, we also looked at the available evidence for the 21 add-ons that featured on the clinic websites, and we found that none was supported by high quality evidence, and only few were supported by moderate or low quality evidence. And importantly, for most of the add-ons, the evidence quality was very low, conflicting, or so imprecise that it was impossible to know if it had any benefits, if it was harmful, or if it had no effect. Next slide. I'm going to use PGT-A as an illustrative example of the discrepancy between what we know about an add-on and how it's described on clinic websites. So PGT-A is used to screen embryos to make sure that they have the right number of chromosomes so that only chromosomally normal embryos are transferred. Now that all sounds good, but there are some risks attached, including a very small risk that the embryo is damaged during the procedure. And the procedure involves removing cells from the part of the 5-day-old embryo that will become the placenta. Once they are removed, the cells are sent for testing and the embryo is frozen until test results are known. Then if there are normal embryos available, the woman comes back the following month for a transfer of a chromosomally normal embryo. And at that point, there is a very slight risk that the embryo hasn't actually survived the freezing and thawing process. Regarding the results, occasionally there can be false positive or false negative results. But the most challenging part of test results is when the embryo is identified as mosaic, meaning that it contains both normal and abnormal cells. Mosaic embryos can be either low or high level depending on the number of abnormal cells. And in fact, about 20% of tested embryos are mosaic. The thing about mosaic embryos is that some have the capacity to self-correct, meaning that over time, the normal cells take over and the abnormal cells disappear. This in turn means that when an embryo is discarded on the basis that it is a mosaic embryo, we are potentially discarding an embryo that might have developed to a healthy baby. And on top of this, the cost of PGT-A is significant and is usually quoted at about $700 per embryo. And this is not subsidized by Medicare. Next slide. So here's what several credible sources say about PGT-A. There was a survey in 2019 of 151 clinics around the world asking whether they ever transferred what was deemed abnormal embryos. And it turns out 20% of clinics did. And when all that data was put together, there was a conclusion that robust pregnancy and live birth rate chances with low miscarriage rates can come from these so-called abnormal embryos. And the authors concluded that PGT-A can't really reliably determine which embryos should or should not be transferred, and that this in turn leads to the disposal of many embryos with excellent pregnancy potential. A 2020 Cochrane review of 13 trials involving almost 3,000 women said that it was uncertain whether PGT-A is an effective addition to IVF. Sorry, I lost my slide here. Sorry, especially in view of how invasive it is and the cost it incurs. They also say that currently there is insufficient evidence to support PGT-A in routine clinical practice. And then a 2021 double-blind prospective non-selection trial showed that there was the same kind of live birth rates and miscarriage rates across euploid, so-called normal embryos, embryos with low-grade mosaic, and embryos with medium-grade mosaic. So these are the studies that I've found, which tells us something about what can happen with PGT-A. And I think it's really well known that women who have a large number of embryos, they can achieve pregnancy sooner and have a lower risk of miscarriage when abnormal embryos are screened out. But for a woman with few embryos, discarding an embryo that had the potential to become a healthy baby, that might actually rob her of the chance of motherhood. So contrast what I told you about what the studies show. Contrast this with some of the claims from clinic websites. And this is just taken off the websites. And some of these claims were also accompanied by cautions about that it might not always work and all of that. But there were, in fact, statements that said that PGT-A can help improve the chance of successful pregnancy. And because PGT-A can't change the quality of the embryo. This, I have to say, is quite a misleading statement. One clinic said that the procedure is suitable to patients who want to increase their chance of a successful IVF cycle. And I think that would really apply to everybody. It says that it can improve the chance of a healthy baby. And the most fanciful, I guess, is that it can overcome the adverse effects of age on IVF success. Now, while I'm sure that doctors give much more nuanced information about PGT-A when they discuss it with individual patients, clinic websites is often where patients go first for information, and these kind of promises might influence their decision to use PGT-A. But it's important for patients to know that the money they spend on PGT-A might be the equivalent of the out-of-pocket cost for an additional treatment cycle. Since most people don't strike luck on their first treatment cycle, a second or third attempt is probably more likely to make the dream of a baby come true than using PGT-A. Can I just check with you, Molly, that we've got the right slide? So if we go to the next one now, have we got a table there?
We sure do.
Oh, good. Add-on use in Australia?
Yep, that's right.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I can't see what you have, so I'm just checking. All right, the next study that Sarah led was an anonymous online survey of women in Australia who had had IVF in the last few years. Almost 1,600 women completed the survey, and more than 80% of them had used one or more add-on. And in 72% of the cases, the add-on they had used had cost them extra money. It was interesting to see that nearly 50% believed that the add-on that they had used was risk-free. If we just look quickly down the list here, two out of the three most commonly used add-ons were actually alternative therapies. The PGT-A came in as a second, and then there were some drugs that people had used and some equipment, and all sorts of other different types of add-ons. Next slide. So women who reported that they had used one or more add-on, they were asked who had recommended the most recent one they used to them. And it turns out for the alternative medicine add-ons like acupuncture and Chinese herbs, they had mostly been recommended by friends and family rather than fertility specialists. But at the clinic-based add-ons, they were mostly recommended by fertility specialists, which is probably not surprising. And then we asked the ones who had used clinic-based add-ons, who had brought it up? And in some cases, nearly 20%, actually the patient herself had brought it up. She'd heard about it or she'd read about it, and she wanted to try whatever it was. But in 70% of cases, it was the fertility doctor that actually brought it up. Next slide. To gauge under what circumstances people thought it should be allowed to use non-proven therapies, we offered scenarios that respondents could endorse. And as you can see here, most thought that it was okay to use add-ons that are low risk, even if it's unknown if they have benefits. But unfortunately, since most add-ons don't have good evidence behind them, it's really not known if they have risks. It's interesting to see, I think, that almost more than 40% of respondents thought that if the patient wants to use it, that is a legitimate reason for having it and a good enough reason for offering it. Next slide. In a free text follow-up question, respondents were asked to elaborate why they thought add-ons should be available even when they don't have the evidence to support them. And I think these quotes really demonstrate the vulnerability of people who are desperate to have a child. Anyone who has worked with patients in a fertility clinic has met people who would do anything to have a baby, irrespective of risk. And I think the quote here illustrates that very well. Anything shy of "this will put you in a coma" is worth the risk. And when there's been repeated failure, patients want their doctor to try something new. And if they have heard of someone who's had a baby after using an add-on, they may ask for that too. And of course, as the woman who had a baby after having had the endometrial scratching, people want to mimic anything that was used in a successful IVF attempt if they come back for another child. I think all of this really shows that discussions in the clinical setting can be a difficult balance between giving people hope and making them lose hope by advising against use of an add-on that the patient believes in. Next slide. So what does all this mean for patients? How can they make truly informed decisions about add-ons? And how can we avoid that commercial interests get in the way of evidence-based practice? Next slide. First of all, for people to be able to make truly informed decisions about add-ons, they really need comprehensive and independent information from credible sources. One of our missions at VARTA is to be one of those sources where people can find up-to-date information about what's known about add-ons in digestible formats. So when new research is published, we translate it for lay audiences and in the form of blogs and pieces in the conversation when we get the opportunity. And we also try to get attention to important new findings in the media. We use our website and also social media platforms to disseminate any news that's of relevance to patients. And last year we put on a webinar that people can still watch where Sarah Lensen and Professor Fakwa, who is a leading researcher in the field, they talk about the questions that patients should ask when they consider add-ons to make sure that they make the best possible decisions for themselves. Next slide. And in all our communications, we really encourage patients to ask the 5 questions recommended by Choosing Wisely campaign before they have any tests, treatments, or procedures. And this is really to help them make more informed decisions. The questions really apply to all areas of medicine, and they are, do I really need this test, treatment, or procedure? What are the risks? Are there simpler, safer options? What happens if I don't do anything? And what are the costs? And we suggest that in the context of IVF, people should ask an additional question, which is, how will this treatment affect my chance of a live birth? Next slide. In the UK, the IVF regulator, the Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority, HFEA, they use a traffic light system to help patients understand the available evidence for add-ons. They have a group of researchers who do an annual review of the available evidence, and then they classify add-ons as green if there's more than one good quality randomized controlled trial, which shows that the procedure is effective and safe. Amber, if there's conflicting evidence, and red, if there's no evidence that this add-on is effective or safe. And of the 12 add-ons currently listed on the HFEA website, most are rated red and none is rated green. Well, this is a helpful tool. We actually have one concern, and that's that people might think that amber means that evidence is gathering and that it's only a matter of time before the light switches to green. But of course, if there is a randomized controlled trial that suddenly shows that the add-on is not effective, it could really just as well switch from amber to red. Next slide. In addition to transparent and comprehensive independent information about add-ons for patients, there needs to be processes to ensure that commercial interests don't override evidence-based practice principles. A 2019 review of the evidence behind add-ons concluded that most are introduced into clinical practice in a hurried manner without any clear evidence of benefit, that they often make IVF more complicated and of course increase the cost of it. They also say that there's no high quality evidence to support the use of these add-ons in routine practice. And they suggest that we really do need large, well-designed randomized controlled trials to evaluate the effectiveness and safety of add-ons. And lastly, they point out that we need to develop an evidence-dictated mechanism for introducing newer interventions into routine clinical settings. That's basically saying that there needs to be rules for when a treatment moves from being experimental and part of research to being offered as a clinical option. Next slide. But because add-on use is largely unregulated, it's hard to see how clinics who compete with each other would agree on a standard or evidence-dictated mechanism for introducing and offering new add-ons. In their critique of add-ons, Jack Wilkinson and his colleagues from the UK, the US, and Australia, they point to some of the consequences of the lack of regulation of add-ons. And they observe that add-on treatments are the new black, that they're provided and at a cost to patients undergoing IVF on the premise that they will improve the chance of having a baby. So regulation, of course, of add-ons, they say, is consistently minimal, which means that they're introduced into routine practice before they have been shown to improve the live birth rate. And they actually suggest that given the robust supportive studies of the effectiveness of these procedures are lacking, questions do arise regarding the appropriateness of offering them to patients who are often desperate, as we've already mentioned, and believe that clinics rely on validated science in all treatments. Next slide. So what could regulators do to make sure clinics adhere to evidence-based practice principles? While it only offers recommendations that are not enforceable, the HFEA has published an agreement between the HFEA and 10 professional and patient bodies, which states that treatments that have no strong evidence of their safety and/or effectiveness should only be offered in a research setting, and that patients should not be charged extra to take part in research, including clinical trials. This report also says that clinics should provide patients with up-to-date information about the evidence-based supporting the use of any treatment add-ons that they offer. They say that patients must be clearly informed of the experimental nature of any treatment add-ons which is offered, where there is no robust evidence of its safety and effectiveness. And they call for accurate and transparent declarations of financial or other interests for patients in the discussions about add-ons. Next slide. Here in Victoria, the government commissioned a review of the ART services a few years ago, and this review was conducted by Mr. Michael Gorton and his team. They did a thorough review, which included interviews with and written submissions by ART stakeholders, including providers and patients. Based on their findings, they formulated many recommendations, and in relation to add-ons, they recommended that the Victorian government should consider a national approach for the state and industry regulators to facilitate the development of quality, accessible resources, which were to advise patients and clinicians on the evidence-based risks and benefits of adjuvant treatments offered in relation to assisted reproductive technology. Now, I think while this all sounds good, I'm not so sure how the Victorian government can implement a national approach to develop resources for patients and clinicians about the risks and benefits of add-ons. And of course, unless there is dedicated funding and a dedicated team to regularly review all the evidence that's published in relation to add-ons, I really can't see that happening. Next slide. And what about the industry itself? What can it do to make sure clinics practice evidence-based medicine? Well, in 2019, the Reproductive Technology Accreditation Committee, RTAC, which is the body that accredits IVF clinics in Australia and New Zealand, they did issue a special bulletin relating to add-ons. Again, it only offers recommendations which are not enforceable, but in my view, also frankly, pretty weak in my view. So whether this bulletin has had any influence on clinics' practice is questionable. Because as I read it, I kind of wonder what the minimize any risk mentioned in the first sentence actually means. Is it risk to patients or risk to clinics' reputation? And regarding the first recommendation, how would patients having access to a list of add-ons that clinic offer minimize any risk? In my mind, it would be more likely to prompt people to use add-ons they might not have even known existed until they saw them on a list. For the second recommendation, I think our review of clinic websites showed that most clinics haven't heeded this recommendation, at least not in the information they have on their websites. Next slide. So lastly, for the question about how to avoid that commercial interest override evidence-based practice, the elephant in the room is perceived or actual conflicts of interest. Blakely and her colleagues conducted a qualitative study a few years ago with ART stakeholders, and these stakeholders, they identified several ways in which commercial interests affect or have the potential to affect clinical practice in ART clinics. They also believe that they linked commercialization in general and corporatization in particular to significant changes in clinical practice. And this, they believe, in turn, was linked to physical and psychological harms to women, as well as harms to the taxpayer from exploitation of the Medicare funding model. Next slide. In an accompanying piece in the conversation, they reminded us that as employees of publicly listed companies, doctors must recognize that their primary responsibility is to the company and its shareholders as a whole. And while I actually think that most doctors put the welfare of their patients well ahead of the company's bottom line, we need to acknowledge that there may be at least perceived conflicts of interest. So the authors of this piece in the conversation, they argued that IVF specialists, ethicists, and other stakeholders, they need to create a forum in which these concerns can be discussed openly and constructively, so that perceived or actual conflict of interest can be identified, acknowledged, and managed. Next slide. On that note, I want to mention the work led by Professor Wendy Lipworth, which is underway right now, and which I hope will help the industry improve their practices and patients to get a better deal in relation to add-ons than they currently have. Wendy leads an NHMRC ideas grant called Addressing Commercial Influences on Assisted Reproductive Technology. And in the 3 phases, some have already been done, I know that, but stakeholders will be interviewed to establish what they believe should be happening regarding commercial influences in ART. They want to develop, and I'm really encouraged by this, a clinically informed ethical legal framework for the identification, appraisal, and management of commercial influences in ART. And in the last phase, they want to generate evidence and engage systematically with end users to determine how this guidance should be implemented in the governance of clinical delivery of ART. Next slide. And while evidence-based medicine is the standard everyone should aspire to, getting robust evidence for add-ons is really hard. Apart from the randomized controlled trials being very costly, huge numbers of participants are needed for trial findings to be conclusive. And really getting patients who are willing to be in the control arm of any ART is always difficult. Anyway, I don't think that should stop us from trying to generate evidence about benefits and risks of add-ons. And as Sarah Lensen's trial demonstrates, it is possible to do. But until there is robust evidence for an add-on, patients should be given all the information they need to make the best possible decisions they can for themselves, including information about any perceived and actual conflicts of interest. Thank you very much.